And cut me off when you need to if I start talking too long, because you guys got something in mind.
I'm Roger Enlow with the Bridge Street History Center. This is August the 16th, 2023, and we're sitting down with Bob Ray Sanders, and he's going to be talking today about John McConnell. John McConnell, we're planning to have an exhibit on him at our Bridge Street History Center. So before we get started, Bob Ray, could you tell a little bit about yourself, a little background about you?
Well, I was born in Fort Worth. My family goes back almost 160 years here, so I know it well. I wanted to be in journalism. My family tells me since I was in the 5th grade, but I knew that I wanted to do it from the 9th grade on, that I was going to major in journalism, which disturbed my father because in those days, keep in mind came up under Jim Crow. No daily newspaper, no daily television station in those days had black people working for them, except as janitors. So my father worried, why are you going to go into a profession that won't hire you? It just so happens that as I grew, of course, came to know, still going through high school, even after the Supreme Court declared that separate but equal schools were inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional, I still went through many more years of segregated schooling, and until I got to North Texas State University, and did indeed major in journalism, and was surrounded by some great people who helped me, not only just educated me, but helped me in many ways in life. And I graduated at about the right time, when every newspaper in the country, almost every major news, decided they had to have one like me. And so, interestingly enough, the day I graduated, I was downtown getting cufflinks for graduation day, applied at the Star-Telegram. And they were doing some things while I was being introduced to editors and all that kind of thing. But when I got home that day, my mother said the Star-Telegram called and said, "Can you start on Friday?" That day, that Friday, began my association with John McConnell. Because of all things, here I am. I'm the new guy in the newsroom. The editor marched me back to the desk where I was going to be seated, and it was along with 4 or 5 other desks of the people that they had named contributing reporters. They were not just reporters, they were contributing editors. And they set me in the middle of them on that back row by the windows. John McConnell was one of those people in that back row who embraced me immediately and became my instant mentor.
Wow. So that says a little bit about John McConnell. What kind of person was John McConnell?
You know what? It's really interesting because, first of all, he's a great writer, and which was obvious by how they were treating him there. And the contributing editors in those days, and that's something they had newly created. These were the superstars of the newsroom. They would take on the big stories, whether they were straight news stories or the investigative stories. And to add that title of not just writer but contributing editor meant that they were standing out. They were the standouts at the newspaper. John was this guy who had this big heart. Now, he was short in stature, but his heart was bigger than he was in many ways. He had a love for humanity. He had a love for nature. He had a love for things that God had made. And it showed. It showed not only in how he treated his colleagues and other people that he would run to, and the subjects of some of his reports. He cared about what he wrote about, and that came out in his writings. Even the early days of just straight news reporting, long before he started to be a columnist, those things showed in his character, and that's one thing you can say. I mean, a lot of people think newspaper people. I'm not talking about you, but a lot of people, newspaper people, don't have character. All they want is a story, just the facts, ma'am. You know, that kind of thing. But John had character, and he looked for that character in the people that he covered.
Did he ever share with you how he developed that? I mean, was that through his parents, or is that just his nature, or did he ever? Share
No,
that?
he never talked about how he got this love for writing. He talked about his growing up, of course. I mean, you know, in rural Texas, coming up, you know, with a family that loved him and nurtured him. But I don't know where he got this thing for writing.
What do you think made John such an outstanding writer?
Well, first of all, John was a good listener. And what I try to teach young journalists today is great that you have all the great questions and all. But if you don't listen to the answers, I mean, really listen, not just go for, okay, I got 10 questions and I'm going to get to those, but I can't listen to the answers to the first question before going to the second question. John listened and he empathized. He really did. I mean, when you go back and look at some of John's stories, the humanness comes out. The humanity of an individual comes out. Whether it's a sad story or a joyful story or whatever, he captured the humanity of an individual. That was his uniqueness. And he did that, I mean, all through his career, in news stories as well as in his columns.
Is there a story or a column that stands out to you that he did?
Oh my God, there were so many stories that he did. I can't think of one in particular, but of course he also got into writing books to tell the story of the Texas that he knew, of the region in Texas that he knew. And he told those stories so well that, you know, they would grip the heart, if you will. I mean, they got your attention and you couldn't let it go.
Did you two talk about journalism or writing styles, or I'm sure y'all visited
You know,
that.
one of the things I remember is we both spoke at Texas A&M University at a journalism conference for students. And we drove down together. I mean, I drove and all the way down we talked about it. Of course, when we got there, we talked about journalism. But yeah, we often talked about journalism, what it ought to mean and what it doesn't mean in some cases. I mean, I think today, I mean, he'd be surprised at what has happened to journalism. Maybe shocked at what's happened to journalism now, as I am to a degree. But no, he cared about the profession so much that he wanted to see its greatness. I mean, every day. And those were the days when the Star-Telegram had 2 different papers, a morning and an evening, 5 different editions for each paper. Because we went out, all the paper circulated almost to El Paso, that far west. And so we had all these little towns, and towns that John understood and knew, where we had correspondents, little old ladies, little old men who would call in, usually obituaries, but something going on in small towns all the way to El Paso. And John understood that territory. He understood that individual who lived in that town. So he could capture that. When I first came on, I mean, I was put on the desk, the city desk, and part of my job in those first couple of months was taking dictation from these great reporters who were out in the field. So I often took dictation from John, calling in, because in those days you had to write from the top of your head. you were out there on a story. You're calling in. We got 5 editions, and you go, and I've got to take the dictation, which is again one of the greatest things that I ever did was to learn to type, because I wouldn't have made it in that job if I didn't know how to type. And well, John, and he called it in, and it rattled off his head. He didn't have to write the story down; it was in his head, and he could spit it out. And I had to type those stories.
Can you think of a particular story that
Oh, I'm trying.
dictated?
I'm trying to think.
There's so many. There's so many.
Yeah, there are so many, because in those days, today, if a reporter does 1 story a day, they're doing a great job. We did 5 and 6 stories a day. I mean, if you had a beat, you definitely did 5 or 6 stories. As I did later on, after my 3rd month at the paper, I was on the courthouse beat, and I'm writing stories from all over. We got 4 courthouses. We've got all those things at the county, the district attorney's office, the sheriff's office. We got all of those things, and I had to make those rounds. And there was a story out of each of those. So again, I can't think of one particular story, because they were all so significant. One of the stories, though, that was a big story those days, we had Sharpstown. I don't know if you know what that is, but it was a scandal in the state of Texas. Sharpstown bank fraud and all that kind of stuff. Well, John and I think Jim Bahuli was one of the superstars, one of the contributing editors. They covered those stories, and between the trials and all of that stuff that was going on, I think a couple of the trials were held in Amarillo or someplace far off. They were getting those stories every day and having to dictate them to us back at the station, back at the office, and getting them in the paper on the front page by the first deadline of 6 o'clock, and then all up until the last deadline of 10 or 10:30. So that was the way it worked in those days.
Did y'all cover you and John, did y'all help cover the Cullen Davis, the murder and the trial, and were y'all involved in that? I assume you were.
Yeah, I mean, I was not involved in that. I actually, when the Cullen Davis case came, John did a lot of coverage of that case. It was so shocking. I had gone to Channel 13 by the time the Cullen Davis case came up. And that, needless to say, and still is to this day, one of the most, how do you say it, most explosive stories that a newspaper in a town, because Cullen Davis was obviously very important, rich man, and you had murder, and including murder of a child, which just shocked people to no end. Then you brought in the sex and all of the things that you could think of in terms of sensationalism was there, but how do you cover it and make it unbiased, trying to tap down the sensationalism, because it was so sensational. You had Cullen Davis' wife, you had the daughter who was dead, you had the boyfriend who was dead, you had, all of these things. And then on top of that, again, the trial is moved from Tarrant County to someplace else, and you get an acquittal. And then you get a case where, with the next trial, there's a threat of the judge's life, to the extent that they even fake, the judge being killed and put in the back of a trunk, and still there was an acquittal. Because and then that brings in a lawyer from Houston, Racehorse Haynes, as I recall, who came in, who did an excellent job. And you can talk about, and there are always rumors of jury tampering and that kind of stuff, but no, that was years of work.
John McConnell was one of the reporters, I believe, who helped carry Lee Harvey Oswald's casket.
Yes.
Did John share some memories of that with you, or?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is, I got to know Marguerite Oswald, and
That was Lee Harvey's
Lee Harvey Oswald's mother. Marguerite, who was convinced. I mean, I don't really look at the Star Telegram. I was over at Channel 13 then, but as I recall, it was on the 10th anniversary of the assassination. I took a film crew and I did the route that Lee Harvey Oswald took from the 6th floor over to Oak Cliff into the theater where he was captured. That night on Channel 13, we had a nightly news show. I said, Lee Harvey Oswald, I used the word alleged assassin. The next day I got a call from Marguerite saying, Bob Ray Sanders, you're a good reporter. You said alleged. And from then we got to, and ours was mostly a friendship of phone and letters, because she'd write me letters. I mean, she was convinced that he had been framed and that he was innocent and all of that. And so, yeah, Johnny and I talked about that, and I told him in my relation, as I got to know her, she lived, I lived on the west side at the time, and so did she. I mean, I would pass her street coming to downtown Fort Worth to Star Telegram, and then later to Channel 13. But yeah, he and all there were no pallbearers. And when the funeral home said, we need to get the casket to the gravesite, John and several other people, I think Mike Blackman, who was with the Associated Press, and some other people volunteered. And of course, in that famous photo of his casket being carried, John is right there. And so he'll have that memory, or we'll have that memory from now on.
What are some other stories about you and John? Was there? I think y'all had a friendship outside of the newspaper.
Yeah, well,
office.
Keep in mind that John's house on Kell Street, I don't know how to describe it. I mean, it was a 2-story house on Kell Street. And it was almost like open. I mean, we would have like rallies there. I mean, we would meet to have, a drink, talk, the shop, the reporters from the Star Telegram would be there occasionally. Some political figures would be there. John hosted those events, and we would get there and we would talk. Occasionally, we would do things like have a typewriter set up in one room and start a story, and everybody was supposed to contribute to it before they left. And then we see how did that turn out. But it was those kind of things, and where we talked about journalism, and most of us were journalists at the time, but I was always invited to those events. And I can remember even his little son would be there at times, and it was just like a family. That's what we were. And I mentioned Channel 13. I mean, I came in 1969 to the paper. The Channel 13 had come to me a couple of times and asked about the possibility of going to work. I hated television journalism in those days. I did. I majored in journalism, which I went print, and I thought television journalists were lazy. I thought they just picked up the newspaper that morning and read my story and called it journalism. But I finally decided to leave and go join Channel 13 after they had done this profile on me, which John said to that day, they were just doing a screen test of you. When they did that story on you, they followed me around the courthouse for 3 days. But at any rate, I decided to leave, and it was a sad time. It was a sad time for me, because I really did enjoy my stay, and I had really been embraced by John and several other people in that newsroom, including my editors. And I called John to the side, and I said, "Okay, I'm going." And he really didn't want me to go. He didn't say this directly, but in a way he thought, this is not what you really want to do. This is not who you are. You are a great writer and journalist, and television doesn't allow that. Well, I mean, and most didn't, but Channel 13 would turn out to be different. But I called him aside and said, I'm appointing you head of my committee to not have a going away party for Bob Ray Sanders at the Star-Telegram. And I said, "You got that?" He said, "Yeah, I got that." And I said, "Okay, no going away party." He said, "Okay, no going away party." And the day I left, sure enough, there was no going away party. But when I got ready to leave, he had left 2 poems on my typewriter, which I have to this day.
Could you read one of those, Bob Ray?
Oh, golly. I need to get my glasses now. And by the way, his nickname was Bunky, and he signed Bunky.
Why?
I don't know. You know what? To this day, I don't know where that came from. But this speaks to our relationship. Walk with me, brother, through the wet grass early in the morning. Let us leave our footprints in the moisture, 2 tracks together, walking. Walk with me, brother, through the clinging fog late at night. Let us find an old window and leave our names written on 2 panes side by side together. Walk with me, brother, in the moist sandy beach at midday. Let us watch the tide and then carve the word humanity in the sand and dot the I's with our toes together. Walk with me, brother, in past days of memories of yesterday, and let us hope when you come back, we can walk the streets as friends and reminisce, and people will see us as 2 men together. And then we'll know that life has moved up a step, and the things we've shared have not been in vain. And of course, I would come back to the Star-Telegram. I mean, 20 years later, I would come back and stay another 20 years. And of course, John was writing columns, so there we were, colleagues again. We were always colleagues, never not colleagues, but working out of the same newsroom.
How did y'all change from when you first met him and then to that period?
We both grew a little wiser, I think. I learned a lot from him that I tried to pass on to others. But he kept expanding. He was writing books. He wanted to tell the world about the nature that he understood and knew, the heritage that he had, those bridges across the Brazos that he wrote about, the walk across Texas. He wanted people to feel some of the things that he had felt. It's just being a part of this state and this culture.
What did you learn from him, Bob Ray, as a writer and also as a person from him?
You know, I mean, the thing was, in my early days particularly, of being a journalist, both he and a couple of the others at the paper, he wasn't critical in the sense that he criticized her to point out. He would occasionally say, you know, you could have done this way. You might have said this instead of that. He was a good critique person.
I've got a feeling that you maybe share the same thing with your students, maybe.
Oh,
Something like
without a doubt. When I critique people, I try to show them what could be, as opposed to what is definitely wrong. I mean, I never heard him say that's wrong, or never do this again, or that. His point was, here's how I think you can make that a little better than what it is right now.
How did John handle criticism from readers?
Oh, you know what? I think we both, and that may be one of the things he taught me. That may be one of the things I learned from him, is that, okay, you've had your say, particularly in terms of column writing, and I got a lot of criticism. I had hate mail. In fact, they did a whole movie on my hate mail. But John's point was, okay, you've had your say. Let them have theirs. And you don't have to feel necessary to debate them. And one of the things that helps for good column writing, again, something I learned from him, is that you try to anticipate what your critics are going to say before you write. And you try to answer that criticism in your first column, as opposed to waiting on them to come back and complain, and then you try to answer them. Answer them before they even say anything. And that's the way he wrote. But he was so good with personal profiles as well. You know, he could take an individual or a family or whatever, and he could make you feel what they were really feeling. And that's something I tried to learn from him. I'm not sure I learned it well enough, but I certainly tried to follow in his footsteps in that regard.
I remember reading one time, John, I think it was a hardware store, an old hardware store in Bluffdale. And I remember he used the sense of smell in his column, and like the sawdust and the paints and all that. And I'll never forget that, because that used a different sense, an emotion, because the smell is such a powerful emotion. I'll never forget that column.
Yeah, the imagery and the sensory feelings of his columns, that's what I mean, the human emotion. That's what he was about.
Anything else, Bob Ray, would you like to say about John McConnell that we have not talked about?
You know what? The only thing else I would add is that he never bragged about himself.
Very humble.
He was humble, just sincere. His emphasis was always on somebody else or something else, never about him.
That's why he was such a great writer.
Yeah, that is why he was such a great writer. and his writing shows that. I mean, if you read him, that's what you see.
Thank you, Bob Ray, for your time.
I thank y'all for taking the time.